Sometimes the hardest part of being broke isn't losing your possessions. It's losing the memories attached to them. Mark had sold nearly everything to keep his kids fed, but he refused to let go of his grandmother's old dresser, even though it was barely worth $50. It was just a heavy oak piece with scratched wood and sticky drawers, but it reminded him of her kindness when times were tough. One night, while cleaning the bottom drawer, he felt something strange about the base. It was thicker than it should be. When he pried it open, what he found inside changed his life forever. But why did his grandfather hide it? And what else didn't his family tell him? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mark Brenner sat at his kitchen table at 3 in the morning, staring at the eviction notice for the third time that night. 52 years old, and this was where life had brought him. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, not from fear, exactly, but from the bone-deep exhaustion that came from 2 years of fighting an uphill battle he seemed destined to lose. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling. His daughter, Chloe, was 16 and asleep in the room she shared with her 14-year-old brother, Preston. Mark had given them the only real bedroom while he made do with the pull-out couch in the living room. It wasn't much, but it was home. Or it had been until this notice arrived. 3 months behind on rent. The number at the bottom of the page might as well have been $3 million for all the chance Mark had of paying it. $1,900. In another life, that might have been manageable. But that life ended 2 years ago when the factory closed and took his job of 23 years with it. He set the notice down and looked around the small apartment. It was a far cry from the house where he'd raised his kids with his ex-wife, Linda. That had been lost in the divorce 3 years ago, along with half of everything else he'd owned. Linda had remarried within a year a dentist named Gregory who lived 2 towns over in a house with a yard and a 2-car garage. The kids visited every other weekend, and Mark tried not to think about the contrast between their 2 homes. The living room was sparse now. He'd sold the television 6 months ago. The good furniture had gone piece by piece over the past year. First the leather recliner his father had given him, then the coffee table Linda's mother had made, then the bookshelf that had held his collection of woodworking magazines. What remained was temporary, borrowed, or too worthless to sell. A sagging couch, 2 folding chairs at the kitchen table, a lamp he'd found at a yard sale. But in the corner, against the wall near the window, stood his grandmother's dresser. It was a substantial piece, solid oak with 6 drawers and brass handles that had tarnished to a dull green. The finish was scratched and worn, the wood darkened with age and layers of furniture polish applied over decades. It wasn't beautiful by modern standards, too heavy, too old-fashioned, taking up too much space in an already cramped apartment. Mark had been offered $50 for it last week by an antique dealer who'd looked at it with the bored expression of someone who'd seen 1,000 similar pieces. $50. Mark had almost taken it. God knows he needed the money. But standing there in that shop, watching the dealer run his hand dismissively over the surface his grandmother had polished every Sunday after church, something in Mark's chest had tightened. He'd mumbled an excuse and loaded the dresser back into Harold's borrowed truck. Harold Finch was Mark's oldest friend, a retired postal worker in his early 60s who lived in the apartment below. He'd been the one to suggest selling the dresser in the first place, not out of cruelty, but out of practical concern. Harold had watched Mark's situation deteriorate month by month. Had loaned him money he probably wouldn't see again. Had brought groceries up the stairs with casual excuses about buying too much at the store. "You're too proud for your own good," Harold had said after Mark returned with the dresser still in the truck. "It's just furniture." But it wasn't just furniture, and they both knew it. Mark stood and walked over to the dresser, running his hand along the top edge. His grandmother, Dorothy, had owned this piece for as long as he could remember. As a child, He'd spent countless summer afternoons at her small house on Maple Street, playing in the yard while she hummed in the kitchen. The dresser had stood in her bedroom, always neat, always polished, a constant in a world that seemed to shift and change too quickly. She'd raised Mark's father alone after her husband. Mark's grandfather died in an industrial accident in 1949. Mark had never known his grandfather, Walter. He died when Mark's father was only 5 years old, leaving Dorothy to navigate the 1950s as a widow with a young son and no education beyond high school. Somehow she'd managed. She'd worked as a seamstress, taking in alterations and mending, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency over fabric while young Mark played with spools of thread on her living room floor. "Your grandfather was a good man," she used to tell Mark. "Smart with his hands, smarter with his head. He would have done great things if he'd had the time. But he hadn't had the time." A crane malfunction at the rail yard had seen to that, and whatever dreams Walter might have harbored had died with him at age 32. Dorothy herself had passed 5 years ago, at 87, her mind still sharp even as her body failed. Mark had been with her at the end, holding her papery hand while she drifted in and out of consciousness. In her final days, she talked about Walter, about the early years of their marriage during the Depression, about how frightened everyone had been. "We thought the world was ending," she'd whispered. "Banks failing, people losing everything. Your grandfather used to have nightmares about it." The dresser had come to Mark after her funeral. His father had died 7 years earlier, a heart attack at 58, worn out from a lifetime of factory work and too many cigarettes, so there was no one else to claim it. Mark's aunt, his father's sister, had moved to Arizona decades ago and hadn't even come back for the funeral. The few distant cousins Mark vaguely remembered from childhood had scattered to the winds. So the dresser became his, along with a few boxes of photographs and his grandmother's wedding china, which he'd already sold during a particularly desperate month last spring. Mark opened the top drawer. It still smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets his grandmother had kept tucked among her things. The drawer was empty now except for a few of his own shirts, folded and stacked with care. The second and third drawers held more of his clothes. The fourth had Chloe's winter sweaters. The fifth Preston's outgrown jackets that Mark couldn't bring himself to throw away. The bottom drawer, the largest, held spare blankets and sheets. He knelt down and pulled open that bottom drawer, intending to retrieve an extra blanket. The October nights were getting cold, and the building's heating was unreliable at best. His hand brushed the folded quilts one his mother had made, another from a discount store, and he started to close the drawer. But it didn't close smoothly. It caught on something, sticking at an odd angle. Mark frowned and pulled the drawer all the way out, setting it on the floor. He peered into the empty space, expecting to see a warped board or a forgotten item wedged in the back. Instead, he noticed something odd about the proportions. The drawer itself was deep, perhaps 10 inches from front to back. But the cavity it had occupied seemed shallower, maybe 7 inches. He reached inside and felt the back panel. Solid wood, smooth, unremarkable. But when he rapped his knuckles against it, the sound was hollow. Mark sat back on his heels, his heart beginning to beat faster. He looked at the dresser's exterior, estimating the depth, then measured with his hand, spanned the interior space. There was definitely a discrepancy. 3 inches, maybe 4, of space that didn't account for anything. He ran his fingers along the edges of the back panel, searching for seams, catches, anything unusual. At first, there was nothing. Then, in the bottom left corner, he felt it a slight gap, barely perceptible, where the wood panel didn't quite meet the frame. Mark stood and went to the kitchen junk drawer, retrieving a flathead screwdriver. His hands were shaking slightly as he returned to the dresser. He inserted the screwdriver into the gap and applied gentle pressure. The panel shifted. He worked carefully, not wanting to damage the wood, prying at the edges until the entire back panel loosened. It wasn't nailed or screwed in place. It was simply fitted tightly into a groove, designed to look permanent but actually removable if you knew it was there. With a final careful wiggle, the panel came free. Behind it was a hidden compartment, and it wasn't empty. Mark's breath caught in his throat. In the dim light from the kitchen, he could make out shapes in the hidden compartment, bundles wrapped in what looked like old cloth, papers tied with string, something that might have been a small wooden box. With trembling hands, he reached in and carefully pulled out the first bundle. The cloth was brittle with age, a faded floral pattern that might have once been part of a dress or pillowcase. He unwrapped it slowly, afraid it might disintegrate under his touch. Money. Old bills. Crisp, despite their age, bound with a rubber band that crumbled to dust as soon as he touched it. Mark held the stack up to the light. $20 bills, but not like any he'd seen in circulation. The design was different, older. He squinted at the date. 1934. His hands shook harder. He set the first stack down and reached for another bundle. More bills, 10s and 20s, all from the 1930s and early 1940s. There were at least a dozen bundles in total, maybe more. He pulled them all out, laying them carefully on the floor beside him. Beneath the money were papers, official-looking documents with ornate borders and elaborate script. He lifted one into the light. United States War Bond, it read across the top. Issued 1943. Made out to Walter Brenner, his grandfather. Mark's mind reeled. He set the bond aside and pulled out more. Some were war bonds. Others were municipal bonds from various cities and counties. All dated from the 1930s and 1940s. All made out to Walter Brenner. At the bottom of the compartment was a small wooden box, no bigger than a cigar case. Mark lifted it out reverently. The wood was smooth, polished, with a simple brass clasp. He opened it. Inside were letters. A stack of them, perhaps 20 or 30, tied together with string that had managed to survive the decades better than the rubber bands had. The envelopes were yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. Each was addressed in the same careful handwriting. To my dearest Dorothy. Mark's throat tightened. These were love letters. From his grandfather to his grandmother. Letters she'd apparently never seen. He untied the string with careful fingers and opened the first envelope. The letter inside was dated March 15th, 1933, written in the same precise hand as the address. My darling Dorothy, it began. I write this knowing you may never read it, but I must record what I've done and why. The banks are failing. Every day we hear of another one closing, people losing their life savings overnight. I cannot let that happen to us, to you, to our future children. Mark read on, his eyes moving faster as the words pulled him in. I've withdrawn everything we had, $347. It isn't much, but it's ours, earned through your sewing and my labor at the rail yard. I've hidden it somewhere safe, somewhere no bank can touch it, no creditor can claim it. When times are safer, when the fear passes, I'll retrieve it and we'll use it to build the life we've dreamed of. But for now, it must stay hidden. Trust me, my love. This is for us. The letter was signed simply Walter. Mark sat back against the wall, the letter still in his hand. His grandfather had hidden money during the Depression. That much was clear. But why had he never retrieved it? And why hadn't he told Dorothy? He reached for the next letter, dated 6 months later. This one mentioned adding more money to the hiding place, another $80, saved from overtime work. The tone was hopeful. The worst seems to be passing, Walter had written. Soon, I'll show you what I've done. You'll laugh at my caution, but you'll be glad of it too. Mark went through several more letters quickly, each one documenting additions to the hidden savings. By 1935, Walter had accumulated over $1,200 of fortune during those years. He'd also begun purchasing bonds, believing they were safer than cash alone. The letters continued through the late 1930s and into the war years. Walter wrote about his work, about his hopes for the future, about the son they'd had in 1944, Mark's father. "Little Raymond will have opportunities we never dreamed of," one letter promised. "This money will see to that. A good education, a better life." But there were no letters after 1949. Mark knew why. His grandfather had died that April in the crane accident. He'd been 32 years old, his son only 5. Mark picked up the last letter in the stack. The date made his chest tighten. April 14th, 1949, the day before Walter died. "Dorothy, my darling," it read, "tomorrow I'm going to tell you everything. I've kept this secret too long, thinking I needed to save more, to wait for the perfect time. But Raymond is growing, and we need to think about his future now, not someday. The money is hidden in your dresser, the one we bought at the auction 5 years ago. I modified it myself, creating a false back in the bottom drawer. You'll laugh when you see how simple it is." The letter continued. "There's nearly $3,000 in cash now, plus the bonds I've been buying. If something were to happen to me, and don't shake your head, accidents happen at the yard, you'll be provided for. Raymond will be provided for. I should have told you years ago, but I kept thinking I'd add just a bit more. Make it perfect. Forgive my caution. Tomorrow, we celebrate. Tomorrow, everything changes." The letter ended with a simple declaration of love and was signed with Walter's name. Mark read it twice, and a third time, his eyes burning. Tomorrow, everything changes. But tomorrow, his grandfather had died, crushed when a crane cable snapped. And he'd never had the chance to tell Dorothy about the hidden money. She'd raised their son alone, working as a seamstress, taking in mending, struggling to make ends meet. All while the answer to her financial hardships sat hidden in her own bedroom furniture. Mark looked at the money spread out before him on the floor, at the bonds, at the letters that told a story of hope and caution and terrible timing. His grandmother had owned this dresser for 50 years after Walter's death. She'd moved it from house to house, polished it lovingly, stored her clothes in it, and she'd never known. The tragedy of it settled over Mark like a weight. His father had grown up poor, had worked in factories his whole life, had died at 58 without ever knowing ease or comfort. All because of an accident that happened one day too soon. Mark gathered the letters carefully and returned them to their box. He stacked the money in neat piles, counted the bonds. There were 18 of them, in various denominations. He had no idea what any of it was worth now, whether Depression-era currency was even still valid, whether bonds from the 1940s could still be redeemed. But sitting there on his apartment floor at 3:30 in the morning, with an eviction notice on his kitchen table and his children asleep in the next room, Mark understood one thing clearly. His grandfather had tried to save his family. He'd hidden this money to protect them from the chaos of his times, intending to reveal it when the moment was right. That moment had never come for Walter, but it had come finally for Mark. He looked at the dresser solid, enduring, keeping it secret for 76 years. Then he looked at the hidden compartment, empty now except for dust and shadows. His hands had stopped shaking. Something like hope, fragile but real, began to unfurl in his chest. Mark didn't sleep. He couldn't. He sat at the kitchen table as dawn broke over the city. The contents of the hidden compartment spread before him like artifacts from an archaeological dig. Every so often he'd pick up one of the bundles, feel the weight of it, try to comprehend what he was holding. The cash alone filled him with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. He'd counted it 3 times, his fingers moving carefully over bills that were older than his father had been. 23 bundles in total. Mostly 20s, some 10s, a few 50s. The total came to $2,847. In 1949, that would have been enough to buy a house. Now, it might cover 2 months of back rent and bills, if it was even valid. Mark had no idea if 70-year-old currency could still be spent, or if it had to be exchanged somehow, or if it was worthless paper. The bonds were more mysterious. 18 certificates, each one declaring a specific value and maturity date. Mark tried to make sense of them, but the financial language was beyond him. Terms like face value and accrued interest swam in his exhausted brain. Some had matured in the 1950s, others in the 1960s. Did that mean they were worthless now, expired like an old coupon? Or did they continue to gain value somehow? He picked up his phone and started searching. Are old savings bonds still valid? The results were confusing, full of government websites with dense paragraphs about Series E bonds and redemption procedures. He learned that some bonds stopped earning interest after 30 years, but could still be redeemed. Others might have different rules. He'd need an expert. The letters he'd read and reread until he'd nearly memorized them. His grandfather's voice came through in every line, earnest, hopeful, trying so hard to do right by his family. The last letter, written the day before his death, was the hardest to read. Tomorrow, everything changes. The cruel irony of those words sat heavy in Mark's chest. At 6 o'clock, he heard movement from the bedroom. Preston emerged first, his hair sticking up in every direction, his 2 small pajama pants riding high on his ankles. He'd grown 3 inches in the past year, and Mark hadn't been able to afford new clothes to keep pace. "You're up early," Preston mumbled, heading for the refrigerator. He stopped when he saw the table. "What's all that?" Mark had hastily covered most of it with a dish towel when he'd heard the door, but Preston was sharp. His son stood there, milk carton in hand, staring at the corner of an old bill that peeked out from under the cloth. "Just some old papers," Mark said. "Found them in Grandma Dorothy's dresser." "Old papers don't usually make you look like that," Preston observed. "Like what?" "Like you've seen a ghost or won the lottery or both." Mark managed a tired smile. "Go get ready for school. I'll make breakfast." Preston hesitated, then shrugged and retreated to the bathroom. Mark heard the shower start a moment later. He gathered everything carefully and returned it to the hidden compartment, fitting the false back panel into place. His secret, for now, until he understood what he had and what it meant. Chloe emerged 20 minutes later, already dressed, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She'd inherited her mother's thick dark hair and her father's gray eyes. At 16, she was becoming someone Mark sometimes barely recognized: confident, quick-witted, already thinking about colleges she probably wouldn't be able to afford. She studied him across the table as she poured cereal into a bowl. "You look terrible." "Thanks, sweetheart. Did you sleep at all?" "Not much." She ate in silence for a moment, then said quietly, "I can get a job. McDonald's is hiring. I'm old enough now." "No." Mark's voice was firm. "You focus on school. That's your job." "Dad, we're 3 months behind on rent. I heard you on the phone with Mr. Kozłowski last week." She met his eyes. "I'm not stupid. I know things are bad." Mark felt something crack in his chest. She was 16. She should be worried about grades and friends and homecoming dances, not whether they'd have a roof over their heads. "I'm handling it," he said. "How?" He almost told her then. Almost pulled out the money and the bonds and the letters and said, "Look, something amazing happened." But caution held him back. He didn't know what he had yet. Didn't know if it was legal, if it was real, if it would actually solve anything. He couldn't give her hope just to snatch it away again. "I'm figuring it out," he said instead. "Trust me." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." But he could see the doubt in her eyes, the resignation of someone who'd heard promises before and watched them crumble. After the kids left for school, Mark stood in the shower and let the hot water pound against his neck and shoulders. His mind wouldn't stop spinning. He needed advice. Someone he could trust who might actually know something useful. Harold. It had to be Harold. He called in sick to work, He was supposed to be mowing lawns for a property management company today and texted Harold, "Can you come up? Important." Harold arrived 20 minutes later, knocking his familiar 3-tap rhythm on the door. He was a solid man, not tall but broad. With silver hair, he kept military short and reading glasses perpetually perched on top of his head. "This better be good," Harold said. "I was about to start my second pot of coffee." Mark gestured him inside and closed the door. "I found something." "Found what?" Instead of answering, Mark knelt by the dresser and removed the bottom drawer. Harold watched, puzzled, as Mark pried loose the false back panel. "I'll be damned," Harold breathed. Mark pulled out the wooden box first, then the bundles of cash, then the bonds. He spread them on the coffee table while Harold stood frozen, staring. "Mark," Harold finally said, "what the hell am I looking at?" "My grandfather's secret." Mark handed him the last letter. "Read this." Harold's eyes moved over the page, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something like wonder. When he finished, he looked up at Mark with wide eyes. "Your grandfather hid all this?" "The day before he died. He never got to tell my grandmother." Harold sat down hard on the couch, still staring at the money. "Do you know what this is worth?" "No idea. That's why I called you." "I mean the cash alone." Harold picked up a bundle, examined it. "This is real. Old, but real. You can probably still use it. Banks take old currency, exchange it for current." "What about the bonds?" "Those I don't know about. But my nephew, Leonard, he works at First National Bank downtown. He'd know. He handles estate stuff, old accounts, all that." Mark felt a flutter of hope mixed with fear. "Can we trust him?" "He's family and discreet. Used to be a lawyer before he went into banking." Harold set down the money carefully. "Mark, this could change things for you. Or it could be nothing. Or it could be illegal somehow. Or one problem at a time." Harold's voice was steady, grounding. "First, we find out what you've got. Then we figure out the rest." Mark nodded. The sun was fully up now, streaming through the apartment windows, illuminating the old bills with their unfamiliar designs, the bonds with their formal declarations, the letters that told a story of love and hope and tragedy. "I can call Leonard," Harold offered. "Set up a meeting. Quiet, unofficial. Just to get information." "Yeah," Mark said. "Okay, do that." Harold made the call that afternoon, speaking in low tones while Mark paced the small apartment. When he hung up, he was smiling. "Leonard can see you tomorrow. 11 o'clock at the bank. He's going to block off an hour, use one of the private consultation rooms." "What did you tell him?" "That you inherited some old financial documents and need guidance." "Nothing specific." Harold paused. He asked if this was about your grandmother. I said yes. That seemed to satisfy him. Mark spent the rest of the day in a strange limbo, unable to focus on anything. He picked up around the apartment, did laundry, tried to watch television on his phone, but his eyes kept drifting to the dresser, to the hidden compartment behind its innocent facade. When the kids came home from school, he took them out for pizza. It was an extravagance he couldn't afford, but he needed to do something normal, something that felt like he was still in control. They sat in a booth at Angelo's, the same place Linda used to bring them on Friday nights when they were younger. "What's the occasion?" Chloe asked suspiciously. "Can a father take his kids out for pizza?" "Not lately," Preston said through a mouthful of pepperoni. Mark tried to smile. "Things are looking up. Did you find a new job?" Chloe's eyes were hopeful. "Not yet, but I'm working on something. Just trust me, okay?" She studied him, then nodded slowly. Whatever she saw on his face seemed to reassure her, at least a little. That night, after the kids were asleep, Mark read through the letters again. There were details he'd missed in his first frantic reading. References to people whose names meant nothing to him now. Friends, neighbors, family members, long dead. But one name appeared more than once. Cyrus. Cyrus and I have been talking. One letter from 1934 read. He's thinking of doing the same, hiding what he can. We made a pact. We'll help each other's families if anything happens. Brothers look out for brothers. Mark frowned. Cyrus. He dug through his memory, trying to place the name. His grandmother had mentioned relatives occasionally, but Mark had been young and hadn't paid much attention. Was Cyrus another grandfather? An uncle? He made a mental note to ask Harold. If anyone would know the family history, it would be him. Harold had known Dorothy for years, had been at her funeral, had heard her stories. The next morning, Mark dressed carefully in his only good shirt and the slacks he saved for rare occasions. He gathered a selection of the bills and several of the bonds, placing them in a manila envelope. The rest he returned to the hidden compartment, along with the letters. No sense bringing everything until he knew more. Harold drove him to the bank in his old Buick. First National occupied a corner lot downtown, a stolid brick building that had probably been there since the 1920s. Inside, it smelled like old carpet and air conditioning. A receptionist directed them to a small conference room on the second floor. Leonard was already there, a man in his mid-40s, with Harold's same solid build, but wearing a carefully pressed suit. He stood when they entered, extending his hand. "Uncle Harold, good to see you." He turned to Mark. "You must be Mark Brenner. Please, sit." They settled around a small table. Mark noticed Leonard's eyes go immediately to the envelope he was carrying. "Harold mentioned you have some old financial documents?" Leonard's tone was professionally neutral, but Mark caught the curiosity underneath. "I found them hidden in a piece of furniture that belonged to my grandmother." Mark opened the envelope and began laying out the bills. "I don't know if they're still valid or worth anything." Leonard picked up the first stack, examined it carefully. His eyebrows rose. "These are Series 1934 Federal Reserve notes. In this condition." He held one up to the light. "They're genuine. And yes, still legal tender. So I can spend them?" "You can, though you'd want to exchange them at a bank first. Most retailers wouldn't know what to make of bills this old." Leonard set the stack down gently. "Where did you say you found these?" "My grandmother's dresser. She died 5 years ago, left it to me. I just discovered a hidden compartment." "And your grandmother never mentioned this money?" "No, I don't think she knew it existed." Leonard's expression shifted to something more thoughtful. "May I ask, when did your grandmother acquire this dresser?" "It was hers for as long as I can remember. Since the 1940s, I think." "And who owned it before her?" "My grandfather. He died in 1949. Understanding dawned in Leonard's eyes. "I see. So your grandfather likely hid this money, and your grandmother never discovered it. That's what the letters say." Mark hesitated, then pulled out one of the letters, not the last one, but an earlier one that explained the basic situation. He handed it to Leonard. Leonard read it slowly, his expression growing more sympathetic with each line. When he finished, he set it down carefully. "Your grandfather was a wise man. A lot of people lost everything when the banks failed in the early 30s. Keeping cash at home wasn't uncommon." He paused. "It's tragic that he never got to tell her. Can you tell me what this is worth?" "The cash?" Leonard did quick mental math. "Face value, about $2,800. Some collectors might pay more for bills in this condition from this era, but not significantly more. You'd be looking at maybe $3,000 if you found the right buyer." Mark's heart sank a little. $3,000. It would solve his immediate crisis, pay the back rent, keep them housed for another few months. But it wasn't a life-changing amount he'd started to hope for. Then Leonard picked up one of the bonds. His expression changed. He studied it carefully, turned it over, examined the seal and signatures. Then he picked up another and another. "These are different," he said quietly. "Different how?" "These are Series E savings bonds. War bonds, essentially, sold to fund the war effort. Leonard pulled out his phone and started typing. The face value here is $50. But these things accrue interest over time. Even after they mature, they can continue to gain value in certain circumstances. Mark leaned forward. How much value? Leonard was silent for a moment, reading something on his phone. It varies by issue date and maturity date. This one from 1943. He did some calculation. If it's never been redeemed, with all accrued interest, we're looking at somewhere between 4 and 6 times face value. So this $50 bond is worth potentially $300, maybe more. I'd need a specialist to give you exact figures. Leonard looked at the other bonds spread on the table. How many of these do you have? 18 total. Various amounts. Leonard's eyes widened. May I see them all? Mark pulled out the rest. Leonard examined each one methodically, making notes on a legal pad. The silence stretched. Mark's pulse hammered in his ears. Finally, Leonard set down his pen and looked up. Mr. Brenner, I can't give you precise figures without consulting our bond redemption specialist. But based on these face values and issue dates, you're looking at somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000. Possibly more. The room seemed to tilt. 50,000? That's a rough estimate. Could be higher. Could be slightly lower. But yes, in that range. Mark sat back in his chair, his hands trembling. $50,000. Not enough to retire on, but enough to everything. Pay off debts. Build a college fund. Breathe for the first time in 2 years. What do I need to do? His voice came out hoarse. First, I'd recommend consulting an estate attorney. Make sure there are no legal complications with the inheritance. Then we can begin the redemption process. It'll take some time. Government paperwork always does, but it's straightforward. Leonard pulled out a business card and wrote a name on the back. Phyllis Cunningham. She handles estate law, very thorough, very trustworthy. Tell her I referred you. Mark took the card with numb fingers. Thank you. I don't know what to say. Say you'll be careful. Word of this gets out. You might find relatives coming out of the woodwork. Leonard's expression was kind but serious. People do strange things when money's involved. Harold, who'd been quiet through the whole exchange, finally spoke. Mark doesn't have much family left. His grandmother's side is pretty small. Even so, Leonard said, discretion is your friend here. They shook hands, and Mark and Harold left the bank in a daze. In the parking lot, Harold let out a long breath. $50,000, he said. If it's real. If there are no complications. It's real, Mark. You saw his face. He knows what he's talking about. Mark looked at the envelope in his hands, at the bonds that represented his grandfather's desperate hope, his grandmother's unknown legacy. I need to call this attorney, he said. Harold clapped him on the shoulder. One step at a time, my friend. One step at a time. Mark called Phyllis Cunningham that afternoon. Her receptionist scheduled him for the following Tuesday, the first available appointment. 4 days felt like an eternity, but Mark tried to focus on the immediate relief Leonard had provided. The cash, at least, was unquestionably his. He took $300 in old bills to First National the next day and exchanged them for current currency. The teller examined each bill carefully, consulted with a manager, but ultimately processed the transaction without issue. Mark walked out with 6 crisp $50 bills that felt surreal in his wallet. That evening, he called his landlord, Eugene Kozłowski. Mr. Kozłowski, it's Mark Brenner. There was a pause. You have my rent money? I can pay 1 month tomorrow. The rest within 2 weeks. Another pause, longer this time. You said that last month. I know, but this time it's real. I came into some money. An inheritance. An inheritance. Kozłowski's voice was skeptical. Right. I can bring you $1,900 tomorrow. Cash. First month of what I owe. The skepticism shifted slightly. Cash? Cash. Fine. Tomorrow 10 a.m. my office. But Brenner, if the rest isn't here in 2 weeks, the eviction proceeds. Clear. Thank you, Mr. Kozłowski. Mark hung up and allowed himself a moment of relief. One crisis deferred. It wasn't solved, but it was deferred, and that was more than he'd had yesterday. Chloe noticed the change in him immediately. That evening, as they ate dinner, actual groceries he bought, not the ramen and canned soup that had been their staple, she watched him carefully. Something happened, she said. Mark glanced at Preston, who was focused on his food. I told you things were looking up. Dad. Her voice was gentle but insistent. What's going on? He set down his fork. You remember your great-grandmother? Dorothy's dresser? The big wooden one in the corner? I found something hidden in it. Money. Old money that my grandfather, your great-great-grandfather, hid during the Depression. Preston's head snapped up. Hidden money? Like treasure? Sort of. He hid it because banks were failing and people were scared. He died before he could tell anyone about it. How much? Chloe asked. Mark hesitated. Enough to get us stable again. Pay the rent, take care of bills. Maybe put some aside for college. Her eyes filled with tears. Are you serious? I'm serious. She stood and came around the table. To hug him, something she hadn't done spontaneously in months. Mark held her, feeling the tension drain from her shoulders. We're going to be okay, she whispered. We're going to be okay. Preston, not to be left out, joined the embrace. For a moment, the three of them stood there in their small kitchen, holding on to each other and the promise of something better. The weekend passed in a strange haze of normalcy, tinged with anticipation. Mark paid Kozłowski, suffered the landlord's suspicious scrutiny, and walked out with a receipt that felt like gold. He bought Preston new shoes, good ones, not the discount store knockoffs he'd been making do with. He gave Chloe money for a school trip, watched her face light up with joy, but he didn't tell them about the bonds yet. Not until he knew for certain they were his, legally and without complication. Tuesday arrived. Phyllis Cunningham's office was in a converted Victorian house near downtown, painted pale yellow with white trim. The interior was warm hardwood floors, comfortable chairs, walls lined with law books and family photographs. Phyllis herself was perhaps late 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She had the air of someone's favorite and approachable, but competent. Mr. Brenner, please, sit. She gestured to a chair across from her desk. Leonard spoke highly of you. He was very helpful. He mentioned you've discovered some old bonds and currency hidden in inherited furniture. Mark laid out the story again. The dresser, the hidden compartment, his grandfather's death, his grandmother's unknowing poverty. Phyllis listened without interrupting, making occasional notes. When he finished, she said, "May I see the documents?" He handed her the envelope. She examined the bonds first, methodically, then the remaining cash. Finally, she picked up several of the letters, reading them with careful attention. These letters establish intent, she said. Your grandfather clearly meant this money for his wife and descendants. That's important. So it's mine legally? Let's trace the chain. The money was your grandfather's. He died in 1949. It would have passed to his wife, your grandmother, as part of his estate, whether she knew about it or not. She never filed any estate paperwork that I know of. In 1949, for a modest estate, she might not have needed to, especially if your grandfather died without a will. Phyllis made another note. Your grandmother died in 2020? 5 years ago, yes. And left a dresser to you? To my father, technically. But he died before her, so it came to me. Do you have documentation of that inheritance? Mark pulled out a folder he'd brought a copy of his grandmother's simple will. Oh, which listed her possessions going to her son or his descendants. His father's death certificate, the bill of sale when he'd put the dresser in storage briefly before moving to his current apartment. Phyllis reviewed everything, then nodded. This is straightforward. The property passed from your grandfather to your grandmother, from your grandmother to your father, from your father to you. The fact that the money was hidden doesn't change the legal chain of inheritance. Relief flooded through Mark. So I can redeem the bonds? You should be able to, yes. Though, she paused, her expression growing more serious. I need to ask about other family members. Your grandmother had other children? My father had a sister. My aunt. She moved to Arizona 30 years ago. We're not in touch. Any other relatives who might contest this? Mark thought about the name in the letters. My grandfather had a brother, Cyrus, but he died in the 70s, I think. Did Cyrus have children? I'm not sure, maybe? My grandmother never talked much about that side of the family. Phyllis leaned forward. Mr. Brenner, legally, this inheritance appears to be yours. But family disputes can get complicated, even when the law is clear. If other relatives learn about this money, they might try to claim your grandfather intended it for the whole family, not just his direct descendants. But the letters help your case significantly. They show intent. But emotions and money make a volatile combination. She paused. I'm not saying don't pursue this. I'm saying be prepared for potential challenges. Mark felt his earlier relief curdle slightly. What do you recommend? Document everything. Keep clear records of where the money came from, the chain of inheritance, all of it. If you choose to share information with other family members, do it carefully. And consider, if someone does contest, are you prepared for that fight? I need this money, Mark said quietly. My kids need it. Then we'll make sure you have the strongest legal position possible. Phyllis pulled out a form. I'll draft a letter establishing the inheritance chain and your legal ownership. You can present that when you redeem the bonds. It should prevent questions. How long will that take? A few days. In the meantime, I'd suggest researching your grandfather's brother's family. Know who might surface if word gets out. Mark left the office feeling both validated and anxious. The money was his, probably, unless someone else decided it wasn't. That evening, he asked Harold about Cyrus. They sat in Harold's apartment, coffee growing cold between them. Harold frowned, thinking back. Cyrus Brenner. Yeah, I remember your grandmother mentioning him once or twice. There was some kind of falling out after your grandfather died. What kind of falling out? I don't know the details. But I got the impression Cyrus asked your grandmother for money she didn't have. Created bad blood. Harold shrugged. Why? Mark told him about the letters, about Cyrus being mentioned. I need to know if he had kids, if they're still around. I can ask around. This is a small enough town. Someone will remember. Harold came through 3 days later. He arrived at Mark's apartment with a handwritten list and a grim expression. Found information about Cyrus, he said, settling onto the couch. Wasn't hard. Just had to talk to some old-timers at the VFW. Mark sat across from him, tension coiling in his stomach. And Cyrus had 2 kids. Daughter named Irene, son named Floyd. Floyd died maybe 10 years ago, but Irene's still around. Lives over in Moordale, about 20 miles from here. Anyone else? Floyd had 3 kids. 2 daughters moved out of state, but his son Clarence still lives local. Works at the tire shop on Route 9. Mark absorbed this. Cousins he'd never met, never even known existed. Did you find out anything about the falling out? Harold nodded slowly. According to Jerry Whitman, he's 86. Knew both brothers. Cyrus came to Dorothy right after Walter died. Asked if Walter had left any money. Dorothy told him no. They were barely scraping by. Cyrus got angry, said Walter had told him about hiding money. Dorothy thought he was being cruel, trying to give her false hope. They had a huge fight. Family split after that. So Cyrus knew about the hidden money. Apparently. But he didn't know where it was hidden. Mark felt cold, which means if they find out I discovered it, they might think they have a claim. Yeah. Harold's expression was sympathetic. What are you going to do? I don't know. Phyllis said legally, it's mine. But she also warned me about family disputes. You could just keep quiet. Get the bonds redeemed. Never tell anyone. Mark had considered that. But he'd also spent the past few days thinking about his grandfather's letters, about the intention behind the hidden money. Walter had mentioned Cyrus with affection. Brothers look out for brothers, he'd written. I need to think about this, Mark said. That afternoon, while the kids were at school, Mark pulled out all the letters again. He read through them chronologically, paying attention to every mention of Cyrus. The picture that emerged was of two brothers who were close, who supported each other through the Depression's worst years. One letter from 1936 particularly struck him. Cyrus lost his savings when his father discovered his hiding spot and took it for gambling debts. He's devastated. I promised him I'd help his family if anything happened to him. That's what brothers do. Mark sat back, troubled. His grandfather had made a promise. But that was in 1936. Had he still felt that way in 1949? The last letter mentioned only telling Dorothy, only securing his own son's future. He was still wrestling with this when Chloe came home. She found him at the table, letters spread out, his head in his hands. Dad, you okay? He looked up. Just thinking. She sat down across from him. About the money? About whether it's really all ours. He explained about Cyrus, about the family split, about the cousins he'd never known. Chloe listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. What do the letters say? She asked. Did great-great-grandpa Walter want to share with his brother? Early on, maybe. Later, I'm not sure. But you inherited it legally, right? That's what the lawyer said. Yes, then it's yours. Her voice was firm. Dad, we need this. I need this. Preston needs this. You've been killing yourself trying to take care of us. Finally, something good happened. Don't give it away out of guilt. It's not that simple. Why not? Did these cousins ever reach out to us? Did they help when we were struggling? Did they even know we existed? Mark had no answer to that. She was right. None of them had maintained contact with his branch of the family. I just want to do the right thing, he said quietly. Chloe reached across and squeezed his hand. Taking care of your kids is the right thing. 3 more days passed. Phyllis called to say the documentation was ready. The bond redemption paperwork was filed. It would take several weeks to process, but the machinery was in motion. Mark exchanged more of the old currency, paid the 2nd month of back rent. Kozłowski accepted it with less skepticism this time, though he still looked at Mark like he expected it to be counterfeit. Then, on Saturday morning, Mark's phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. Hello? Is this Mark Brenner? A woman's voice, elderly, uncertain. Yes, who's this? My name is Irene Brenner. I think we might be cousins. Mark's heart stopped. How did you get my number? I hope you don't mind. I saw Leonard Finch at church last Sunday. He mentioned you'd been in with some old family documents. When I heard your name, well, Brenner isn't that common around here. And I remembered my father talking about his brother Walter having a son. Mark sank into a chair. What do you want? To talk, if you're willing. I'm 73 years old. Mr. Brenner, I've spent my whole life wondering about the family split, about what really happened. Leonard wouldn't tell me details, of course. But he said you found something in your grandmother's furniture. There was something in her tone, not demanding, not aggressive. Just tired and curious. I did find something, Mark admitted. Was it the money my father always talked about? The money he said Walter hid? Yes, a long silence. Then, may I ask, did you find letters too? My father said Walter wrote letters about it. I did. Would you? Her voice cracked slightly. Would you be willing to meet, to talk? I don't want anything from you, Mr. Brenner. I just want to understand what happened. My father died, believing his brother had betrayed him. I'd like to know the truth. Mark thought about the letters, about the affection between the brothers before tragedy and misunderstanding tore them apart, about his grandfather's promise to help Cyrus's family. All right, he said. We can meet. Thank you. Relief flooded her voice. There's a diner on Main Street, Murphy's. Do you know it? I know it. Tuesday morning? 10 o'clock? I'll be there. After he hung up, Mark sat staring at his phone. Harold had warned him about word getting out. Now it was happening. Irene sounded sincere, but that didn't mean others would be. And Clarence Floyd's son was still out there. Mark pulled out his grandfather's last letter and read it again. Tomorrow, everything changes. For Walter, tomorrow had brought death and lost chances. For Mark, tomorrow was bringing family complications he didn't know how to navigate. He called Harold. It's starting. Cyrus's daughter contacted me. We're meeting Tuesday. Harold was quiet for a moment. Want me to come with you? Yeah, Mark said. I think I do. Then I'll be there. Mark looked at the dresser, solid and silent in the corner. It had kept Walter's secret for 76 years. But secrets, once revealed, had a way of spreading beyond your control. He just hoped he was ready for what came next. Tuesday morning arrived cold and gray. Mark dressed carefully, as if armor could be found in a clean shirt and pressed slacks. Harold picked him up at 9:30, and they drove to Murphy's Diner in silence. The diner was a relic from the 1950s. All chrome and red vinyl, with a counter that had probably served 3 generations of locals. Mark and Harold took a booth near the back, ordered coffee, and waited till Irene arrived at 10 o'clock precisely. She was small, almost fragile-looking, with white hair cut short and eyes that were surprisingly sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a cardigan despite the diner's warmth and carried a large purse and what looked like a photo album. Mr. Brenner? She approached their booth tentatively. Mark stood. Please, call me Mark. This is my friend Harold. They shook hands, and Irene slid into the booth across from them. Up close, Mark could see the family resemblance, something in the shape of her face, the set of her eyes. She had Walter's nose, the same one Mark saw in the mirror. Thank you for meeting me, she said. I know this must be strange. It is, Mark admitted. But I'm curious too. A waitress came by, and Irene ordered tea. They waited in awkward silence until it arrived, steam rising from the cup in gentle spirals. My father died in 1977, Irene began. I was 31. On his deathbed, he told me about Walter, about the money they'd both tried to hide during the Depression. He said Walter had been smarter about it, had found a better hiding place. She stirred her tea slowly. He also told me about the fight with your grandmother. He regretted it until his last breath. He didn't know where the money was hidden. Mark asked. No, Walter apparently never told him the specifics. Just that he'd succeeded where my father had failed. Irene looked up, meeting Mark's eyes. My father didn't die well off, Mr. Brenner. He worked in the mills his whole life. Died with medical debts and not much else. My brother Floyd, he struggled too. Died young, like so many Brenner men seemed to. The sadness in her voice was genuine. Mark felt his defenses soften slightly. I'm sorry, he said. We all have our burdens. She opened the photo album, turning it so Mark could see. The first page showed 2 young men, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. That's Walter and Cyrus in 1928. They were 21 and 19. Mark stared at the photograph. His grandfather looked so young, so alive, so full of hope. Beside him, Cyrus had the same mischievous smile, The same working-class pride in his posture. Irene turned the pages slowly. More photographs. The brothers at a county fair, standing beside an old truck, sitting on a porch with beer bottles in hand. In every image, they looked inseparable. They loved each other, Irene said simply. My father never got over losing that. Mark pulled out his own envelope. I brought copies of the letters. I thought you might want to see them. Irene's hands trembled as she took them. She read the first one slowly, then the second. Tears began sliding down her cheeks. She dabbed at them with a napkin but kept reading. When she finished, she looked at Mark with red-rimmed eyes. He did care. My father wasn't wrong about that. No, Mark agreed. He wasn't. May I ask? Irene folded her hands on the table. How much was there? Mark hesitated, glancing at Harold gave a slight nod. About 3,000 in cash. 18 bonds that are worth significantly more now. And legally, it's yours? My attorney says yes. It passed through inheritance from my grandfather, to my grandmother, to my father, to me. Irene nodded slowly. That makes sense. I'm not here to challenge that, Mark. I just wanted to know the truth. To understand what really happened. Relief flooded through Mark. Thank you for saying that. My children are grown, doing well. My husband left me a decent pension. I don't need money. She smiled sadly. But I didn't need to know my father wasn't crazy or cruel. That there really was hidden money. That Walter really had meant to help us. They talked for another hour. Irene shared stories about Cyrus, about growing up knowing half her family had cut them off. Mark shared what he remembered of Dorothy, of the grandmother who'd never known the treasure hidden in her own furniture. It's a tragedy all around, Irene said finally. Walter trying to protect his family, dying too soon. Dorothy struggling while the answer sat in her bedroom. My father bitter and angry, never understanding. 76 years of misunderstanding, Harold added quietly. Irene gathered her things to leave. She wrote her phone number on a napkin and pushed it across the table. If you'd ever like to talk again, or if you want to meet my children, they'd love to know about this side of the family. I'd like that, Mark said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. They walked out together. Standing in the parking lot as cold November wind whipped around them, Irene hugged Mark, a quick, slightly awkward embrace, and then got into her car and drove away. That went better than I expected, Harold said. Yeah. Mark watched her taillights disappear. But she mentioned a brother. Floyd had kids too. Clarence, Harold confirmed. The one at the tire shop. You think he'll be as understanding? Harold's expression answered before his words did. Irene had her father's deathbed confession, knew the family history. She's had decades to make peace with it. Clarence, I don't know what he knows or what he thinks he's owed. They drove back to Mark's apartment in thoughtful silence. Mark felt better about meeting Irene, about sharing the letters with her. But he also felt exposed now. Word was out. The secret was spreading. That evening, as Mark was making dinner, his phone rang. Another unknown number. Hello? Is this Mark Brenner? A man's voice, rough and aggressive. Who's calling? Clarence Brenner. I think you've got something that belongs to my family. Mark's stomach dropped. I don't know what you're talking about. The hell you don't. My cousin Irene called me. Said you found the money my grandfather and yours hid together. Said you're keeping it all. It wasn't hidden together. It was my grandfather's money and my grandmother's furniture. My grandfather had equal right to it. They were partners. Made a pact. That's not what the letters say. I don't care what some old letters say. Clarence's voice rose. Half that money is ours. My grandfather died poor because Walter's family kept what should have been shared. That's not true. My grandmother never even knew. You've got two choices, cousin. Share it fair, or I get a lawyer. And trust me, I know lawyers who'll tie this up for years. The line went dead. Mark stood holding the phone, his hand shaking. Across the room, The dresser sat in its corner, innocent and silent, the source of all this chaos. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. This isn't over. Mark called Phyllis Cunningham first thing Wednesday morning. Her receptionist put him through immediately when he explained it was urgent. Clarence Brenner contacted me, Mark said without preamble. He's threatening legal action. Tell me exactly what he said. Mark recounted the phone call and the text message. Phyllis listened without interrupting, and he could hear her typing notes. He has no legal standing, she said when he finished. The money was hidden by your grandfather and property your grandfather owned. The chain of inheritance is clear and documented. But he said, I know what he said. People threaten lawsuits all the time, Mr. Brenner. Very few follow through, especially when they have weak cases. She paused. That said, even a frivolous lawsuit costs money to defend. It's a common intimidation tactic. Mark's chest tightened. I can't afford a legal battle, which is exactly what he's counting on. He wants you scared enough to settle. Her voice softened. Are you willing to fight this if necessary? Mark thought about Chloe's college dreams, about Preston's worn-out shoes, about the eviction notice that had seemed like the end of the world just 2 weeks ago. Yes, he said. I'll fight. Good. Don't respond to any more calls or texts from him. All communication goes through me from now on. I'll draft a letter establishing your legal position and send it to him. Sometimes that's enough to make people back down. After hanging up, Mark sat at his kitchen table feeling hollowed out. Harold came up an hour later, took one look at Mark's face, and put on a pot of coffee. Clarence? Harold asked. Mark nodded. Phyllis says he has no case, but even fighting a bad lawsuit costs money. How much does he want? He didn't say exactly, but he thinks half the money should be his because his grandfather and mine were partners. Harold snorted. Partners in being scared during the Depression, maybe. That doesn't make them business partners. Try telling Clarence that. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Harold said, What if you offered him something? Not half, but something. Just to make him go away? Phyllis said not to negotiate directly. I know what Phyllis said, but lawyers think in legal terms. Sometimes the human solution is different from the legal one. Harold leaned forward. You've got roughly $60,000 coming, right? What if you offered him $5,000, $10,000? Enough to feel generous, but not enough to break you? Mark had considered this. The idea of giving Clarence anything rankled. The man had been nothing but threatening. But the alternative was months of legal battles, stress, uncertainty. Let me talk to Phyllis about it, Mark said finally. He called her back that afternoon. To his surprise, she didn't immediately dismiss the idea. Settlement is always an option, she said, but you need to be strategic about it. Don't offer anything until we've made our position clear. Let him see how strong your case is first. If he persists, then we can discuss a settlement that releases you from all future claims. How long will that take? I'll send the letter today. Give him a week to respond. Then we'll reassess. The week that followed was one of the longest of Mark's life. He jumped every time his phone rang, convinced it would be Clarence with more threats. But there was only silence from that quarter. The bond redemption paperwork continued its slow progress through bureaucratic channels. Phyllis kept Mark updated. Everything was proceeding normally. No red flags, no complications. The money was coming. He just had to be patient. Chloe noticed his tension. One evening, she cornered him in the kitchen. It's that cousin, isn't it? The one who called? Mark didn't see the point in lying. He's threatening to sue. Says the money should be shared. Can he do that? Phyllis says no. But people can file lawsuits even when they're wrong. It costs money to defend yourself. Chloe's expression hardened. So he's trying to bully you into giving him money. Essentially, yes. That's disgusting. She was quiet for a moment, then said, What are you going to do? Wait. See if he backs down. If not, I might offer him something small. Just end it. You shouldn't have to do that. No. But sometimes doing what we shouldn't have to do is easier than fighting. She hugged him then, fierce and sudden. You're a good dad. Whatever happens, remember that. A week later, Phyllis called. I received a response from Clarence Brenner. Actually, from his attorney. Mark's heart sank. He hired a lawyer? Appears to be his brother-in-law, who does small claims work. The letter is, she paused, and Mark could hear paper rustling. It's poorly argued. He's claiming your grandfather and his grandfather had an oral partnership agreement to pool resources. There's no evidence of that beyond the letters mentioning they discussed hiding money. So, what happens now? I've drafted a response refuting his claims point by point. But Mark, I think this might be the time to consider settlement. Not because we'd lose, but because this man seems desperate. Desperate people do unpredictable things. What would you recommend? $5,000, with a signed release absolving you of all future claims. Frame it as a family gesture, not a legal concession. Mark did the math in his head. $5,000 from $60,000 left him with $55,000 still life-changing money. Still enough for everything he needed. Okay, he said. Let's try it. Phyllis arranged a meeting for the following Tuesday. Mark, Harold, and Phyllis would meet with Clarence and his attorney at Phyllis's office. Neutral ground, professional setting, everything documented. The night before the meeting, Mark couldn't sleep. He got up at 2 a.m. and stood looking at the dresser, running his hand over its scarred surface. I'm trying to do right by everyone, he whispered to it, to the memory of his grandfather it held. Your son, your brother, both families. I hope that's what you would have wanted. The dresser, as always, kept its counsel. Tuesday morning dawned clear and cold. Mark dressed in his good clothes again, feeling like he was preparing for battle. Harold met him downstairs, and they drove to Phyllis's office together. You ready for this? Harold asked. No, but I'm doing it anyway. Phyllis met them at the door, ushered them into the conference room. Clarence and his attorney should be here any moment. Remember, let me do the talking. If he tries to engage you directly, just stay calm. I'll try. You'll do fine. She squeezed his shoulder. You're being more generous than most people would be. 5 minutes later, the receptionist showed in 2 men. The first was middle-aged, rumpled, carrying a beaten briefcase, clearly the brother-in-law attorney. The second was Clarence. He was Mark's age, maybe a few years younger, but looked older. Life had worn him down. Mark could see it in the deep lines around his eyes, the gray threading his hair, the defensive hunch of his shoulders. He wore work clothes, stained at the knees, and his hands were calloused and oil-stained. Their eyes met across the conference room. In that moment, Mark saw something unexpected. Not just anger, but pain. Deep, generational pain. This wasn't just about money. It was about 76 years of family wounds that had never healed. They took seats on opposite sides of the conference table. Phyllis made introductions, her tone professional and cool. Clarence's attorney, a man named Gerald Voss, set his briefcase on the table with a thump that felt deliberately aggressive. Let's get to it, Voss said. My client believes he's entitled to half of the money and bonds discovered by Mr. Brenner. Phyllis opened the folder calmly. Your client is entitled to nothing. The money was hidden by Walter Brenner and property owned by Walter Brenner. It passed through clear legal inheritance to my client. Walter and Cyrus Brenner had a partnership. An informal conversation about mutual fears during the Depression is not a legal partnership. Phyllis slid a document across the table. This is the inheritance chain, fully documented. This is Walter Brenner's last letter, establishing his intent to provide for his wife and son, not his brother's family. Voss picked up the letter, read it, his expression souring. Beside him, Clarence leaned forward to see, his jaw tightening. My grandfather died on welfare. Clarence said suddenly, his voice rough. Alone in a county home. He worked his whole life and had nothing. My father, his voice cracked slightly. My father died at 49 from a heart attack brought on by stress. We buried him in a pauper's cemetery because we couldn't afford better. Mark felt the words like physical blows. I'm sorry. Your family got everything. The dresser, the house, whatever else there was. We got nothing. And now you find this money and think you can keep it all? My grandmother didn't get everything, Mark said quietly. She raised my father alone, working as a seamstress. She died in a nursing home on Medicaid. My father worked in factories his whole life and died at 58. Nobody in my family prospered, Clarence. But you got the furniture. You got what was hidden. By chance. Because my grandmother kept one piece of furniture for 50 years, never knowing what was in it. Voss cleared his throat. Regardless of individual hardships, the fact remains that Cyrus Brenner had an agreement with Walter Brenner. My client deserves compensation. Your client deserves nothing legally, Phyllis said. However, she paused, looked at Mark. He nodded. My client is willing to offer a settlement. Not as a legal concession, but as a family gesture. Clarence's eyes narrowed. How much? $5,000. In exchange for a signed release, absolving Mr. Brenner of all future claims. 5,000? Clarence's voice rose. That's insulting. The total is 60,000, and you're offering me 5? The total is 60,000 that legally belongs to my client, Phyllis said firmly. This offer is generous, not obligatory. Voss leaned over to whisper to Clarence. Mark could see them arguing in low voices. Clarence shaking his head, gesturing sharply. Harold, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. Clarence, can I show you something? Everyone turned to look at him. Harold pulled out a photograph, the one from 1948, showing both families together. He set it in the middle of the table. That's your grandfather, Cyrus, Harold said, pointing. And that's Walter. This was taken 1 year before Walter died. 1 year before the fight that split your families. Clarence stared at the photograph. Mark watched his expression shift, anger giving way to something more complicated. They loved each other, Harold continued. They were brothers. They supported each other through the worst economic disaster this country ever saw. And then a misunderstanding, a terrible, tragic misunderstanding, tore them apart. He looked at Clarence, then at Mark. You two are cousins. You're the same generation that lost fathers too young, that watched your family struggle. This money can't fix 76 years of pain. But it doesn't have to create more, either. The room was silent. Clarence's hand moved to the photograph, his fingers tracing the outline of his grandfather's face. I never met him, Clarence said softly. He died when I was 3. My father barely talked about him, except to say we'd been cheated by the other side of the family. My grandmother barely talked about Cyrus either, Mark said. Just that there'd been a fight she never understood. She died thinking your grandfather was cruel for accusing her of hiding money. But she really didn't know? She really didn't know. She struggled her whole life while the answer sat in her bedroom. Clarence picked up the photograph, studied it more closely. They look happy here. They were, Mark said. According to the letters, they were close. Your grandfather's bad luck, his father finding and taking his hidden money, that wasn't Walter's fault. Walter tried to help in his own way, by keeping everything for himself, by trying to protect his own family first. Maybe that was selfish. Maybe if he'd lived, he would have shared. We'll never know. Mark paused. But I do know this. I'm not trying to cheat you. I'm offering you money. I don't legally owe you because we're family. Because this feud has gone on long enough. Voss leaned close to Clarence again, whispering urgently. Mark caught fragments. Bad offer. Demand more. Lawsuit. But Clarence was shaking his head. He set down the photograph and looked at Mark directly. I'm tired, he said simply. I'm 47 years old, working a job that's destroying my back, with nothing to show for it but bills. When Irene told me about this money, I saw a way out. A way to finally catch a break. His voice was raw with honesty. But I'm also tired of being angry at people I don't even know. My grandfather was angry. My father was angry and wanted to get them. Early graves. So what do you want? Mark asked gently. Clarence was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I want this to be over. Voss started to protest, but Clarence held up a hand. Gerald, I appreciate your help. But this is my decision. You're entitled to more, maybe, maybe not. But dragging this through courts for years. Clarence shook his head. I don't have the energy for that kind of fight. He turned back to Mark. 5,000 isn't half. It's not even close. But you're right that you don't legally owe me anything. So I guess, he swallowed hard. I guess I should be grateful you're offering anything at all. The bitterness in his voice cut at Mark. This wasn't how he wanted this to end, with Clarence feeling defeated. Accepting charity, he resented. Wait, Mark said. He looked at Phyllis. Can I speak privately with Clarence for a minute? Phyllis frowned. I'd advise against that. I know, but I want to anyway. Harold stood. Come on, Phyllis. Let's give them 5 minutes. Phyllis looked like she wanted to argue, but Harold was already steering her toward the door. Voss started to object, but Clarence nodded at him. It's okay, Gerald. Give us a moment. When the door closed behind them, Mark and Clarence sat alone in the conference room. The photograph still lay between them on the table. I don't want you to feel like you're accepting charity, Mark said quietly. But that's what it is, isn't it? You giving me money out of pity. No, it's me trying to right something that went wrong a long time ago. Our grandfathers loved each other. They tried to survive impossible circumstances. And bad timing, bad luck created a wound that's lasted 3 generations. Clarence picked up the photograph again. My father used to say the Brenners on your side thought they were better than us. My grandmother never said that. She didn't understand. She thought your grandfather was being cruel, accusing her of having money when she was barely surviving. And all along, it was sitting in her dresser. Yeah, they sat in silence. Mark thought about everything Phyllis had said, about legal rights and clear inheritance chains, about how he could walk away from this meeting owing Clarence nothing. But he also thought about his grandfather's letters, about the promise to help Cyrus if anything happened, about brothers looking out for brothers. The 5,000, Mark said slowly. It's not just to make you go away. It's because your grandfather helped my grandfather survive the Depression, because they supported each other when things were desperate, because that kind of loyalty should mean something, even 76 years later. Clarence's eyes were wet. My kids think I'm crazy for pursuing this. They said I should let it go. My daughter said the same thing. Said we need the money too much to share it. Do you? Need it? Mark almost laughed. I was 3 months behind on rent 2 weeks ago. Facing eviction. I've sold everything I owned just to keep us fed. So yeah, we need it. But you're still offering me 5,000. Because it's the right thing to do. Not legally, Phyllis has made that clear, but morally. Mark paused. And because I want my kids to know their cousins, to know where they came from, to understand that family is supposed to mean something. Clarence wiped his eyes roughly. You really mean that? About the kids' meeting? I do. Irene gave me her number. Said her children would like to meet this side of the family. I'd like that too. For Preston and Chloe to know they have more family than they thought. I've got 2 daughters, 19 and 22. They'd probably like that. Then let's make it happen. Not because of money, but because it's time to heal what was broken. Clarence set down the photograph carefully. Can I ask you something? Sure. Would you let me see the letters? Not to keep, just to read. I'd like to know what my grandfather meant to yours, what they meant to each other. Mark felt a weight lift from his chest. I'll do better than that. I'll make you copies. You should have them. They're part of your family history, too. Thank you. Clarence's voice was thick. That means a lot. Mark stood and extended his hand. 5,000. A signed release saying there are no future claims. And a promise that we stay in contact. That we introduce our kids. That we try to be family again. Clarence stood and took his hand. The handshake turned into something more an awkward embrace. Two men who'd never met trying to bridge a lifetime of division. When they separated, Clarence was smiling slightly. Walter would have liked you. I think Cyrus would have liked you too. They called the others back in. Voss looked resigned. Phyllis cautiously optimistic. Harold openly relieved. We have an agreement, Clarence announced. 5,000 in exchange for a full release. And copies of the family letters. Phyllis pulled out the paperwork she'd prepared. They spent the next 30 minutes reviewing terms, signing documents, making it official. Mark wrote a check from the account where he'd deposited the exchanged currency. His hand shook slightly as he signed it, but not from fear. From something closer to hope. When everything was signed and witnessed, they stood. Clarence folded the check carefully and put it in his wallet. Then he picked up the photograph. Can I get a copy of this too? Keep that one, Harold said. I've got the original. Clarence's eyes widened. You sure? I'm sure. They walked out together into the cold November afternoon. In the parking lot, Clarence turned back. Mark, thank you, not just for the money, for everything else. Thank you for being willing to end this, for choosing peace over anger. They shook hands again, and Clarence got into his battered truck and drove away. 3 months later, Mark stood in his apartment on a Saturday afternoon, watching as his family gathered. The space felt smaller with so many people, but in a good way, like a house filled with warmth instead of emptiness. Irene sat on the couch, sharing stories with Chloe. Clarence's daughters, Amy and Jennifer, were teaching Preston a card game at the kitchen table. Harold moved between groups, playing the role of family historian, filling in gaps in stories that had been lost over decades. The bonds had finally cleared. $47,000 after taxes and fees. Combined with what remained of the cash, Mark had just over $50,000. Not the original 60, but more than enough. More than he'd ever dreamed of having. He'd paid off every debt. Rent current, utilities caught up, a small emergency fund in savings. Chloe had a college fund that would cover 4 years at the state university. Preston had new clothes, new shoes, and a confidence Mark hadn't seen in years. The constant knot of anxiety that had lived in Mark's chest for 2 years had finally loosened. But the money wasn't the best part of what had happened. Clarence arrived with his wife, carrying a covered dish. Hope you don't mind. Karen insisted on bringing her famous potato salad. The more the better, Mark said, taking the dish. They'd met 3 times since the settlement, once just the two of them over coffee, once with their kids, and now this, a full family gathering. Each meeting had been less awkward than the last, the old wounds slowly healing through simple acts of showing up and trying. Can I see it? Clarence asked quietly. Mark knew what he meant. He led Clarence to the corner where the dresser still stood, polished and cared for. Clarence ran his hand over the surface, just as Mark had done countless times. It's beautiful. I can see why you kept it. It kept a secret for 76 years. Felt wrong to let it go. Clarence knelt and opened the bottom drawer. Can you show me? Mark removed the drawer and carefully pried loose the false back panel. The compartment was empty now, but Clarence stared into it like he was looking at something sacred. They were so scared, Clarence said softly. Both of them. Scared of losing everything. They survived, though. And somehow, we're here because of them. Yeah, Clarence closed the panel, replaced the drawer. My grandfather would have liked this, knowing we're all together again. They returned to the living room, where Irene was showing photographs to the younger generation. She'd brought an entire album pictures of Cyrus through the decades, of Floyd as a child, of a family that had lived parallel to Mark's own without ever connecting. "Look at this one," Irene said, holding up a photo from 1946. "That's your great-grandfather, Cyrus, with Floyd, your grandfather, Clarence, at the county fair." "He looks happy there," Amy observed. "He was. Some years were better than others. But he carried a lot of sadness, too, over losing his brother's friendship." Chloe looked at the photograph, then at Mark. "It's sad they never fixed things." "But we did," Mark said. "That has to count for something." Later, as they ate together, paper plates balanced on laps, conversation flowing, Mark caught Harold's eye. His friend smiled and raised his coffee cup in a silent toast. After the meal, Jennifer asked if she could take a photo of everyone together. They arranged themselves in the living room, the dresser visible in the background, a conscious echo of the 1948 photograph that had helped break the ice between Mark and Clarence. "Say family," Jennifer instructed. "Family," they chorused, and the camera flashed. As evening approached and people began to leave, Clarence pulled Mark aside one last time. "I want you to know I expected to hate you. Expected you to be arrogant or greedy or, I don't know, someone I could justify being angry at. And instead you were just a guy trying to take care of his kids. Like me, like our fathers, like our grandfathers." Clarence paused. "I'm glad I was wrong about you. I'm glad we got the chance to figure that out." They embraced again, less awkward this time, more genuine. Clarence's family filed out, followed by Irene, each of them promising to stay in touch, already talking about Christmas plans. When everyone had gone, Mark and his kids cleaned up together. Preston was unusually chatty, excited about his new cousins. Chloe was quieter, but Mark noticed her carefully placing the new family photo on top of the dresser. "You okay?" he asked her. "Yeah, just thinking." She looked at the dresser. Great-great-grandpa Walter tried so hard to save everyone, to make everything safe. But he ran out of time. He did, but you didn't. You found what he hid, and you used it right, not just for us, but for everyone. Mark pulled her into a hug. "Your opinion is the only one that matters to me. Then know this, I'm proud of you, Dad." Preston joined the embrace, and they stood there in their small apartment, holding each other. The dresser watched from its corner, silent and enduring, no longer holding secrets, but instead bearing witness to healing. That night, after the kids were asleep, Mark sat alone in the quiet. He pulled out his grandfather's last letter and read it one more time. "Tomorrow everything changes." Walter had written those words 76 years ago, never knowing how prophetic they'd be. Tomorrow had brought tragedy for him, but somehow, eventually, it brought redemption too. Not the redemption he'd planned, but perhaps something better: two branches of a broken family finding their way back to each other. Mark carefully returned the letter to its box. He'd keep the originals, but the copies he'd made for Clarence and Irene meant the history would live on, shared and understood by everyone it touched. He stood and walked to the dresser one final time, placing his hand on its scarred surface. "Thank you," he whispered, "for keeping your secret until the right moment, for waiting until someone who needed it would find it." The dresser, as always, said nothing. But in the moonlight streaming through the window, it seemed to glow softly, not just a piece of furniture, but a keeper of stories, a bridge between generations. Proof that sometimes what's hidden is meant to be found, not for treasure alone, but for the healing it makes possible.